A lullaby drifts on the wind, its melody thin and wavering, as if sung by a voice that has long since faded into the mist. Imagine it, a child's song, echoing through empty streets, weaving between shuttered windows and doors bolted tight against the night. The village is called Ashen Hollow, a name that lingers on the tongue like a secret or a warning. If you listen closely, you might still hear the faintest hum of that lullaby, a ghostly refrain that refuses to die. But what if I told you that Ashen Hollow is more than just a forgotten dot on a crumbling map? What if I told you that its silence is not the silence of peace, but of something stolen, something erased? Tonight, I invite you to step into the fog with me, to walk the crooked lanes where children once played, and to confront a story that has never been told in full. This is not a tale of war, nor of famine, nor of the ordinary tragedies that history records with ink and stone. This is the story of an epidemic that left no graves, no headstones, no names carved in sorrow. An entire generation vanished, and the world looked away. Ask yourself, what would it mean for an entire plague to leave no trace? No bodies, no mourning, not even a memory that dares to speak its name aloud. Why did the people of Ashen Hollow choose to forget? Or did something darker force their silence? If you think you know how history works, if you believe that every tragedy leaves a mark, then stay with me. Because what happened in Ashen Hollow will challenge everything you think you know about loss, memory, and the shadows that linger when the world refuses to look. Ashen Hollow sits at the edge of the world, or so it seems to those who have ever found themselves wandering its winding, rutted roads. The village is cradled in a shallow valley, hemmed in by ancient woods whose branches knit together overhead, blotting out the sun and muffling the sounds of the outside world. In the mornings, a thick, pearly fog rolls down from the hills, swallowing the cottages and fields, blurring the boundaries between earth and sky. It is a place that feels suspended in time, untouched by the feverish progress of the cities beyond the forest's edge. To a stranger, Ashen Hollow might appear almost idyllic. The cottages are built of pale stone, their thatched roofs mossy and soft, their gardens tangled with wildflowers and herbs. Chickens scratch in the dust, and the air is often sweet with the scent of apple blossoms or wood smoke. Children's laughter once could be heard drifting from the meadows, mingling with the lowing of cows and the distant toll of the church bell. The villagers themselves are a quiet, self-sufficient people, their faces weathered by wind and worry, but quick to smile at a neighbor or offer a hand to a stranger in need. Yet beneath this pastoral charm, there is a sense of something unsettled, something that prickles at the back of the neck. The woods, for all their beauty, are dense and forbidding, and the villagers warn their children not to stray too far after dusk. The church, with its leaning steeple and cracked bell, stands at the heart of the village like a sentinel, its graveyard overgrown and strangely empty. There are no grand monuments here, no family crypts or marble angels, just a scattering of weathered stones, their inscriptions worn smooth by rain and time. The people of Ashen Hollow are wary of outsiders, and even warier of questions. They speak in low voices, glancing over their shoulders as if afraid of being overheard by something lurking just out of sight. There are stories, of course every village has its legends, but in Ashen Hollow, the stories are told only in whispers, and only when the fog is thick enough to hide the telling. They speak of the Hollow's founding, of the old ways and the old gods, of bargains struck and debts unpaid. But there is one story that is never told in full, one shadow that falls across every hearth and doorstep, the story of the orphans. Plague. It began, they say, with a chill in the air that would not lift, even as spring crept in and the fields turned green. The children grew pale and listless, their laughter fading, their eyes ringed with shadows. At first, it was dismissed. as a passing illness, the sort that comes and goes with the changing of the seasons. Mothers brewed herbal teas and fathers chopped extra wood for the fires, but the children did not improve. Instead, the sickness seemed to deepen, settling into their bones, stealing their voices and their dreams. The first whispers of fear began to circulate at the market, in the hush of the church after Sunday prayers. Some blamed the damp, others the restless spirits of the woods. A few, older and more superstitious, muttered about curses and omens, about debts owed to the land itself. But no one dared speak too loudly, for fear of drawing the wrong kind of attention. In Ashen Hollow, secrets are as much a part of life as the fog and the silence. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, a sense of unease thickened, pressing in on the village like the mist that never quite lifted. Doors were locked earlier, windows shuttered tight. The children were kept indoors, their faces pressed to the glass, watching the world grow smaller and stranger with each passing day. And still, the sickness spread, silent and relentless, leaving no mark but the growing emptiness in the eyes of those it touched. It was then, in the hush before the storm, that the first child vanished. No one saw her go, and no one heard her cry. By morning, her bed was empty, her shoes neatly placed by the door. The village awoke to a silence deeper than any before, a silence that seemed to swallow even the memory of laughter. And so began the orphan's plague of darkness that would settle over Ashen Hollow, leaving behind only questions and a fear that would never quite fade. In Ashen Hollow, the children were the heart of the village, their lives woven into every field, every hearth, every whispered hope for the future. There were not many, perhaps 24 in all, but each was cherished, their names spoken with pride and affection. The village was small enough that every child was known by every adult, and their laughter was a kind of currency, traded freely in the lanes and meadows, a promise that the hollow would endure another generation. There was Elsie Morrow, the baker's daughter, with hair the color of ripe wheat and a laugh that could coax a smile from even the sternest elder. She was the first to rise each morning, helping her mother knead dough in the dim light before dawn, her hands dusted with flour, her cheeks flushed with warmth. Elsie was a dreamer, always spinning stories for the younger children, tales of hidden kingdoms in the woods and secret treasures buried beneath the old well. She wore a red ribbon in her hair, a gift from her father, and was never seen without it. Then there was Thomas Finch, the blacksmith's son, sturdy and solemn beyond his years. He was the eldest of 5, his hands already calloused from helping in the forge, his eyes dark and watchful. Thomas rarely spoke, but when he did, the other children listened. He was their protector, the one who would stand between them and the shadows at the edge of the woods. His little sister Mary followed him everywhere, clutching his sleeve with small, determined fingers. The twins, Abigail and Alice Red, were inseparable, their voices rising in song as they skipped through the fields, their braids flying behind them. They were known for their mischief, for the way they could vanish into the hedgerows and reappear hours later, pockets full of stolen apples and wildflowers. Their mother, a widow, watched them with a mixture of pride and worry, her eyes always searching the horizon for their return. And there was Samuel Pike, the vicar's son, quiet and thoughtful, with a mind full of questions and a heart full of doubts. He spent his days reading in the churchyard, his nose buried in books too old and heavy for his age. Samuel was drawn to the graveyard, to the stories carved in stone, to the mysteries that lingered in the spaces between words. He was the first to notice the changes, the way the fog seemed thicker, the way the birds fell silent at dusk, the way the other children's laughter grew brittle and forced. Each family in Ashen Hollow carried its own burdens, its own secrets. The Morrows, who had lost a child to fever years before and never spoke of it. The finches, whose patriarch drank too much and raged at shadows only he could see. The reeds, scraping by on the edge of poverty, their home patched and mended with whatever could be found. The pikes, haunted by faith and doubt in equal measure, their prayers growing more desperate with each passing night. Yet for all their troubles, the village was bound together by a fierce, unspoken love for its children. They were the future, the hope that kept the fields tilled and the fires burning. When one fell ill, the others gathered at the door, bearing gifts of broth and bread, offering prayers and comfort. When one was lost, the grief was shared by all, a wound that bled through every household. But as the orphan's plague crept in, the children began to change. Elsie's laughter faded, her stories growing darker, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. Thomas grew restless, waking in the night to stand at the window, watching the woods with a fear he could not name. The twins stopped singing, their games turning secretive, their whispers sharp and urgent. Samuel's questions grew more insistent, his dreams troubled by visions of empty graves and silent streets. Small things began to go missing: a favorite doll, a wooden horse, a pair of shoes left by the door. The children spoke of strange dreams, of voices calling from the fog, of shadows moving just beyond the edge of sight. Some began to sleepwalk, their feet muddy in the morning, their faces pale and drawn. Others grew silent, refusing to eat or speak, their eyes hollow and distant. The parents watched in helpless terror, their love turning to fear as they realized they could not protect their children from whatever darkness had taken root in the hollow. They clung to old remedies, to prayers and charms, to the hope that this sickness, like all others, would pass. But deep down, they knew something was different this time, something ancient and hungry, something that would not be appeased. If you are a parent or have ever loved a child, ask yourself, what would you do to protect your own? How far would you go to keep them safe, to shield them from a threat you cannot see or name? In Ashen Hollow, every parent would soon be forced to answer that question, and the choices they made would echo through the village long after the last lullaby had faded into silence. It began on a night so ordinary that no one marked it as the threshold between before and after. The fog was thicker than usual, curling in ghostly tendrils around the eaves and slipping beneath the doors. The air was heavy, pressing down on the thatched roofs and seeping into the bones of the villagers. Fires burned low in every hearth, and the children were tucked into their beds, their faces flushed with the fever that had settled over the hollow like a shroud. Elsie Morrow lay restless beneath her patchwork quilt, her red ribbon clutched in one hand. She tossed and turned, her skin clammy, her breath shallow. In her dreams, she wandered through endless corridors of mist, searching for something she could not name. Voices called to her soft, insistent, just beyond the edge of hearing. She tried to answer, but her voice was lost in the fog, swallowed by the silence that pressed in from all sides. In the Finch house, Thomas sat awake by the window, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. He could hear Mary's ragged breathing from the next bed, the faint whimper she made as she dreamed. He wanted to wake her, to tell her it was only a dream, but something held him back, a sense that if he moved, if he broke the stillness, something terrible would happen. The night felt stretched, unnatural, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. The Reed twins, Abigail and Alice, slept curled together like kittens, their arms entwined. Their mother watched over them, her hands trembling as she smoothed their hair. She had heard them whispering before sleep, their voices urgent and afraid. "Don't go," one had said. "Don't follow the singing." But now they were silent, their faces pale in the moonlight, their breaths shallow and uneven. Samuel Pike dreamed of the churchyard, of graves yawning open, of shadows slipping between the stones. He saw the village empty, the streets choked with fog, the church bell tolling a single mournful note. He tried to run, but his legs would not move, and the fog closed in around him, thick and suffocating. He woke with a start, his heart pounding, the taste of earth and ash on his tongue. Throughout the village, the night was punctuated by strange sounds, a door creaking open, footsteps on the path, the distant echo of a lullaby carried on the wind. Dogs whined and scratched at the doors, their hackles raised. The cows in the byre stamped and lowed, uneasy. The air was charged with a sense of waiting, as if the hollow itself was holding its breath. But the adults, exhausted and afraid, clung to denial. They told themselves it was only a fever, that the children would recover with rest and care. They whispered old prayers, hung charms above the beds, and tried not to listen to the stories that crept in with the fog. No one wanted to believe that something was truly wrong, that the sickness was more than just an ordinary malady. They remembered other winters, other illnesses, and told themselves this too would pass. Yet as the hours dragged on, a sense of dread grew, slow and inexorable. Some parents woke in the night to check on their children, only to find them gone from their beds, the sheets still warm, the pillows indented by small, vanished heads. Others found their children standing at the window, eyes wide and unseeing, lips moving in silent song. A few, desperate, searched the house from cellar to attic, calling names that dissolved into the fog. By morning, the village was changed. The sun rose weak and pale, struggling to pierce the mist. The streets were empty, the silence deeper than ever before. In house after house, parents found beds empty, shoes lined up neatly by the door, toys abandoned on the floor. The children were gone, vanished without a trace, as if they had simply melted into the fog. Panic swept through Ashen Hollow like wildfire. Mothers screamed, fathers tore through the woods, calling names that echoed back to them, unanswered. The church bell rang out, a frantic, discordant peal that shattered the morning stillness. Neighbors gathered in the square, their faces white, with fear, their voices rising in confusion and accusation. Some blamed the fever, others the old gods, still others the sins of the village itself. But no one could explain how so many children could disappear in a single night, leaving behind no footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing but the lingering echo of a lullaby and the oppressive weight of the fog. The village elders tried to restore order, to calm the panic, but their words rang hollow. The hollow had always been a place of secrets, but now those secrets had teeth. As the day wore on, hope gave way to despair. Search parties combed the woods, the fields, the riverbanks, but found nothing, no bodies, no clothing, not even a scrap of ribbon or a muddy footprint. It was as if the children had been swallowed whole by the mist, erased from the world in a single terrible night. And so, the first night of vanishing passed into legend, a wound that would never heal. The parents of Ashen Hollow clung to each other, their grief raw and unspoken, their eyes haunted by the memory of empty beds and silent rooms. The village was changed forever, its innocence lost, its future stolen away by a darkness that no one dared to name. By morning, the beds were empty, and the hollow would never be the same. The days that followed the vanishing were a fever dream of confusion and terror. The fog, once a familiar companion, now pressed against the windows like a living thing, thickening with each sunrise, refusing to lift. The village, so recently bound by the laughter of its children, was now a place of frantic whispers and darting eyes. Every home became a fortress, every neighbor a potential threat. At first, the parents clung to hope, desperate and irrational. They scoured the woods, calling their children's names until their voices broke. They searched the riverbanks, the old mill, the abandoned well at the edge of the fields. Some even dug in the earth, convinced that the children had fallen into. Hidden hollows or been buried by some cruel twist of fate. But the land gave up no secrets. The only answer was silence, and the silence grew heavier with each passing hour. Desperation bred suspicion. The Morrows accused the Finches of hiding, the children of some secret pact or ancient grudge. The Reeds, always outsiders even in their own home, found themselves shunned, their door marked with a smear of ash one morning, a warning or a curse. The Pikes, with their endless prayers and cryptic sermons, became the target of muttered accusations. Perhaps the vicar's faith had failed, or perhaps it had summoned something best left undisturbed. The village square, once a place of gathering and gossip, became a battleground. Arguments erupted over nothing, over a missing loaf of bread, a broken fence, a glance held too long. Old wounds were reopened, old debts remembered. The sense of community that had once defined Ashen Hollow was unraveling, thread by thread, replaced by a gnawing fear that no one dared name. Superstition flourished in the vacuum left by reason. The elders, who had always kept the old ways alive in secret, now spoke openly of omens and curses. They remembered stories from their own childhood, stories of the Hollow's founding, of bargains struck with the land, of children taken as payment for sins unconfessed. They hung charms above their doors, sprigs of rowan and iron nails, and burned sage in the streets to ward off evil. The church, once a sanctuary, became a place of dread. The bell's toll was now a summons to fear, not faith. Yet not everyone surrendered to superstition. A few clung to rational explanations, desperate to impose order on the chaos. The village doctor, a man of science and stubborn pride, insisted that the children had fallen victim to a rare and virulent illness, one that caused fever, delirium, and perhaps, in their confusion, led them to wander into the woods. He organized search parties, mapped the surrounding land, and kept meticulous records of every symptom, every sighting, every scrap of evidence. But his efforts yielded nothing, and his certainty began to crack. Others whispered of darker possibilities. Some said the children had been taken by the spirits of the woods, angered by the villagers' neglect of ancient rites. Others blamed the river, which had run low that spring, its banks choked with weeds and silt. A few, their minds frayed by grief, accused their own kin-mothers, turning on fathers, siblings on siblings, convinced that someone among them must be responsible. The nights grew longer, the darkness deeper. Fires burned in every hearth, but the warmth did little to dispel the chill that had settled over the hollow. Doors were barred, windows shuttered. The sound of footsteps in the fog, once a comfort, a sign of life, now sent hearts racing with fear. Every creak, every whisper, every shadow became a threat. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed to have seen figures moving in the mist, children, pale and silent, their eyes empty, mouths open in soundless song. Others spoke of strange lights in the woods, of voices calling from the river, of dreams that left them waking in terror, their sheets damp with sweat. The line between waking and dreaming blurred, and the village began to eat itself from within. The vicar, desperate to restore order, called for a day of fasting and prayer. The villagers gathered in the church, their faces gaunt and hollow, their eyes fixed on the altar. He spoke of faith, of hope, of the need to trust in one another. But his words rang hollow, drowned out by the storm of fear that raged just beneath. The surface. When the service ended, no one lingered. They filed out in silence, each returning to their own private hell. It was during these days that the first accusations of witchcraft surfaced. An old woman, long suspected of dabbling in herbs and charms, was found beaten in her cottage, her belongings scattered, her cat drowned in the well. No one claimed responsibility, but everyone knew who had done it. The message was clear. The village would not tolerate any threat, real or imagined. The children's absence became a wound that would not heal, a constant reminder of the village's failure. Every parent saw guilt in the eyes of their neighbors. Every neighbor saw suspicion in the faces of their friends. The bonds that had once held Ashen Hollow together were now twisted into knots of fear and resentment. Would you trust your neighbor or turn on them? In the face of the unknown, would you cling to reason or surrender to the comfort of superstition? The people of Ashen Hollow were forced to answer these questions, day after day, as the fog thickened and the darkness deepened. And as the days slipped by, hope faded, replaced by a grim determination to survive, no matter the cost. The village was no longer a community, but a collection of frightened individuals, each guarding their own secrets, each haunted by the same unspoken question. If the children could vanish without a trace, what else might be taken before the dawn? The decision to quarantine Ashen Hollow was not made in a single moment, but rather crept in as inexorable as the fog itself. It began with a single door, barred and bolted from within, a mother refusing to let her neighbor cross the threshold. Then another and another, until the village became a patchwork of isolated islands, each family marooned in their own home, peering out through cracks in the shutters at a world grown suddenly hostile and strange. The elders, those who remembered the old ways, were the first to act. They gathered in secret, beneath the ancient yew at the edge of the graveyard, their faces shadowed by hoods in fear. There, they spoke of rituals long forbidden by the church rites, meant to appease the spirits of the land, to beg forgiveness for unknown sins. They burned offerings of bread and salt, poured milk at the roots of the yew, and whispered prayers in a language older than memory. Some villagers, desperate for any hope, joined them in the darkness, clutching talismans and muttering charms. Others recoiled, clinging to the teachings of the vicar, who thundered from his pulpit that only faith in God could save them. The vicar himself was a man torn in two. By day, he moved from house to house, offering comfort and prayer, his Bible clutched tight in trembling hands. By night, he knelt alone in the church, his prayers growing more frantic, his faith battered by the silence that answered him. He preached unity, but the village was fracturing along old fault lines, faith against tradition, reason against superstition, hope against despair. The doctor, a man of science and progress, watched the rituals. With mounting horror, he argued for isolation, for strict measures to contain what he still insisted was a contagion. He drew maps of the village, marking each house where a child had vanished, each family that showed signs of illness. He ordered the sick to be confined, the healthy to avoid all contact. He spoke of miasmas and invisible threats, of the need for cleanliness and order, but his words fell on deaf ears. The villagers, terrified and exhausted, trusted neither the old ways nor the new. They trusted only in their own fear. And so, the quarantine took on a life of its own. Doors were sealed with wax and ash, windows nailed shut. Food was left on doorsteps, exchanged in silence, hands never touching. The market square, once the heart of the village, became a wasteland of abandoned stalls and rotting produce. The church bell, once a call to gather, now tolled only for the dead, though no bodies were ever found and no graves were ever dug. Inside the homes, the psychological toll was immense. Families huddled together, their world shrinking to the size of a single room. The air grew thick with fear and suspicion. Every cough, every fevered dream became a potential omen. Parents watched their children with haunted eyes, searching for the first signs of the sickness, dreading the moment when they, too, might vanish into the fog. The children, those who remained, grew quieter with each passing day. They no longer played or sang. They sat by the windows, staring out at the empty streets, their faces pale and drawn. Some spoke of dreams of voices calling to them, of hands reaching through the mist. Others grew listless, refusing to eat or speak, their spirits crushed by the weight of isolation. The breakdown of social order was swift and brutal. Old rivalries flared into open hostility. A loaf of bread left unguarded was stolen within minutes. Accusations flew of hoarding, of witchcraft, of betrayal. The Reeds, already marked as outsiders, found their home vandalized, their well poisoned. The doctor's house was pelted with stones after he refused to treat a child whose family had broken quarantine. The vicar's sermons, once a source of comfort, now rang hollow in the empty church. Yet even as the village tore itself apart, there were moments of desperate, defiant hope. A mother, risking everything, slipped out under cover of darkness to leave a basket of food at her neighbor's door. A father, his own child lost, stood guard outside the church, daring the darkness to take another. The elders, their rituals, exhausted, began to share stories of other plagues, other times when the Hollow had been tested and survived. These stories, half remembered and half believed, became a lifeline for those who could not bear the silence. The contrast between faith and reason, tradition and progress, became a chasm that could not be bridged. The doctor, isolated in his own home, wrote feverishly in his journal, documenting every symptom, every rumor, every failed attempt at control. He railed against the ignorance of the villagers, even as he felt the grip of fear tightening around his own heart. The vicar, his faith shaken, began to question the very foundations of his belief. He found himself drawn to the old you, to the rituals he had once condemned, searching for answers in the shadows. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the village in silence. The woods pressed closer, their branches scratching at the windows like the fingers of the lost. The river, once a source of life, now ran sluggish and dark, its banks choked with weeds. The fields lay fallow, untended, the crops withering in the damp. Inside, the villagers waited. For what, they could not say. For the sickness to pass, for the children to return, for the world to right itself. But as the days stretched into weeks, hope became a memory, and fear became the only constant. If you have ever known the terror of isolation, the ache of watching a loved one slip away, you may understand a fraction of what the people of Ashen Hollow endured. Their world had become a prison, their faith a battleground, their traditions both a comfort and a curse. In the end, it was not the sickness that broke them, but the silence of empty rooms, of unanswered prayers, of a future stolen away by a darkness that no one could name. And still, the fog lingered, thick and impenetrable, as if the Hollow itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The village was no longer a place of life, but a mausoleum of secrets, each home a tomb, each heart a reliquary of grief. The quarantine was silent, but its echoes would haunt Ashen Hollow for generations to come. As the weeks bled into months, the most chilling truth of Ashen Hollow began to settle over the village like a second, heavier fog. There were no graves, not a single mound of earth, not a single stone carved with a child's name. The children had vanished, and with them, the rituals of mourning that had always followed loss. No funerals, no processions, no weeping at the churchyard gates. Only silence, and the gnawing sense that something essential had been stolen. Not just the children, but the very possibility of closure. At first, the absence of bodies was a source of hope. The parents clung to the idea that their children might still be alive, lost in the woods or hidden by some benevolent force. Search parties continued, though with less conviction, their calls, growing weaker as the days wore on. The doctor, ever the rationalist, cataloged every theory, every rumor, every scrap of evidence. He noted the lack of physical remains, the absence of blood or struggle, the way the children's belongings were always left behind, as if they had simply stepped out for a moment and forgotten to return. But as the seasons turned and the fog refused to lift, hope curdled into something darker. The villagers began to whisper of other possibilities, possibilities that twisted the mind and soured the soul. Some spoke of disease, a sickness so virulent it left no trace, consuming its victims utterly. The doctor dismissed this, pointing out that even the most terrible plagues left bodies behind, to be buried or burned. Others suggested that the children had been taken by a cult, spirited away in the night for some unspeakable purpose. The elders, their eyes haunted by memories they would not share, shook their heads and muttered of debts owed, of bargains struck in the village's earliest days. The churchyard, once a place of solace, became a site of dread. The vicar, desperate to restore order, insisted on daily prayers for the lost, but the congregation dwindled until he was left alone, his voice echoing off empty pews. He walked the graveyard each evening, searching for signs, a scrap of cloth, a footprint, a message carved in stone. But the earth remained undisturbed, the grass unbroken. The only sound was the wind in the yew, whispering secrets the living could not bear to hear. It was Samuel Pike, the vicar's son, who first noticed the change in the graveyard. He wandered there at dusk, drawn by a sense of unease he could not name. He saw the way the shadows pooled around the oldest stones, the way the fog seemed to thicken near the yew. He found small things, doll's eyes, a child's shoe, a lock of hair tied with a red ribbon half buried at the roots, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow the last traces of the lost. He told his father, but the vicar only wept, his faith unraveling with each new day. Rumors spread that the children had not simply vanished, but been taken by the land, by the woods, by something older and hungrier than any disease. The elders spoke of the Hollow's founding, of a pact made to assure the village's survival. The land gives, and the land takes, they said, their voices trembling. We have forgotten the old ways, and now the debt is due. Some villagers, desperate for answers, began to leave offerings at the yew bread, milk, toys, even locks of their own hair, hoping to appease whatever force had claimed their children. The doctor, refusing to accept superstition, launched his own investigation. He examined the village records, searching for patterns, for any clue that might explain the disappearances. He found references to previous outbreaks, strange illnesses, sudden deaths, always centered on the children. But in every case, the records ended abruptly, the details obscured by time and fear. It was as if the village itself conspired to forget, to erase the past and start anew. One night, driven by a mixture of dread and determination, the doctor broke into the church archives. By candlelight, he pored over brittle pages, piecing together a history of loss and silence. He found mention of a ritual performed once every generation, meant to renew the covenant and protect the hollow from the hunger of the woods. The details were vague, the language cryptic, but the implication was clear. The village had always known that something waited in the fog, something that demanded a price. The crescendo came on a night when the fog was so thick it seemed to smother the very air. The villagers, restless and afraid, gathered in the square, drawn by a sense of impending doom. The elders stood at the center, their faces pale and resolute. The vicar, broken and hollow-eyed, clutched his Bible but said nothing. The doctor, wild with revelation, tried to speak, but his words were drowned out by the rising wind. And then, as if summoned by their fear, the ground beneath the yew began to tremble. The earth split open, revealing a hollow space beneath the roots. From the darkness came a sound, a lullaby, soft and mournful, sung in voices that were both familiar and impossibly distant. The villagers fell to their knees, weeping and praying, as the truth washed over them. The children had not been taken by disease, nor by human hands, but by the land itself. The hollow demanded its due, and the price was always the same. In that moment, the boundaries between past and present, between the living and the lost, seemed to dissolve. The villagers saw visions of children dancing in the fog, their faces serene, their eyes empty. They saw the elders of generations past performing the same rituals, making the same sacrifices. They saw themselves trapped in an endless cycle of fear and forgetting, unable to break free. The earth closed again, the lullaby fading into silence. The villagers staggered home, their hearts heavy with the weight of knowledge. There would be no graves, no bodies, no closure, only the memory of what had been lost, and the certainty that the hollow would demand its price again. And so, the greatest mystery of Ashen Hollow was revealed not in the presence of death, but in its absence. The children were gone, and with them, the hope of ever understanding what darkness truly haunted the hollow. The village would survive, as it always had, but at a cost that could never be repaid. I am not of Ashen Hollow. My name is Dr. Jonathan Hargreaves, and I arrived in the village on the first day of autumn, summoned by a letter that spoke only of a sickness of the children, and a silence that will not break. I have seen epidemics. Before cholera in the city, fever in the countryside, but nothing prepared me for the peculiar, suffocating dread that clung to this place. I came as a man of science, determined to bring reason to bear on whatever darkness had settled here. I left with my faith in reason shaken, my mind haunted by questions that have no answers. From the moment I stepped off the cart, I felt the weight of eyes upon me. The villagers watched from behind curtains, their faces pale and wary. The air was thick with suspicion, and the fog seemed to swallow every sound. I was greeted by the vicar, a gaunt man whose hands trembled as he spoke. He told me of the children's disappearance, of the fever that had swept through the village, of the silence that followed. He begged me to help, but I could see in his eyes that hope was already lost. I began my investigation with the rigor of a man who believes in facts. I examined the empty beds, the abandoned toys, the shoes lined up by the doors. I questioned the parents, though most would not meet my gaze. I searched the woods, the riverbanks, the fields, looking for any sign of the missing. I found nothing. No footprints, no blood, no evidence of struggle. It was as if the children had simply ceased to exist. The villagers offered their own explanations, each more outlandish than the last. Some spoke of a curse, others of a debt owed to the land. The elders whispered of rituals and bargains, of a hunger that could not be sated. The doctor who had served the village before me, a man named Ellis, had left behind a journal, its pages filled with fevered notes and half-mad theories. He wrote of patterns, of cycles, of a darkness that returned every generation. He wrote of the yew tree, of offerings left at its roots, of dreams that bled into waking life. I tried to dismiss these stories as superstition, the desperate inventions of minds unhinged by grief. But the more I saw, the harder it became to hold on to my certainty. I witnessed the quarantine, the sealing of doors, the breakdown of trust. I saw the way the villagers avoided the churchyard, the way they flinched at the sound of a child's song. I heard the lullaby myself, drifting through the fog on nights when sleep would not come, a melody both beautiful and terrible, filled with longing and loss. I kept my own journal, recording every detail, every theory, every moment of doubt. I wrote of the rituals I witnessed in secret, of the offerings left at the yew, of the way the earth seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I wrote of the vicar's despair, of the doctor's rage, of the elder's resignation. I wrote of the dreams that plagued me, dreams of children's faces, pale and silent, their eyes wide with sorrow. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered to the edge of the graveyard. The fog was so thick I could barely see my own hands. I heard voices soft, singing just beyond the veil. I saw shapes moving among the stones, flickering at the edge of sight. I felt a coldness settle in my bones, a certainty that I was not alone. I fled, heart pounding, and did not return until dawn. In the end, I could not explain what happened. In Ashen Hollow, I could not find the children, nor could I offer comfort to those left behind. I left the village with my journal, my mind a tangle of questions and fears. I have read and reread my notes, searching for a pattern, a clue, a rational explanation. But all I find is the same emptiness, the same silence. What would you believe if you saw this? If you walked the fog-choked lanes, if you heard the lullaby in the night, if you saw the way the villagers flinched from hope, would you cling to reason or surrender to the darkness? I do not know what I believe anymore. I only know that Ashen Hollow is a place where the past is never truly buried, where the land remembers every debt, and where the silence is filled with the echoes of the lost. I leave these words as a warning, or perhaps as a plea. If you ever find yourself in a place where the fog never lifts, where the children's laughter has faded, where the earth is hungry and the graves are empty, remember Ashen Hollow. Remember that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, and some stories are best left untold. Years passed, and the world beyond the woods forgot Ashen Hollow. The fog still clung to the valley, but the village itself seemed to mend, at least on the surface. New children were born, new crops planted, and the market square once again filled with the hum of daily life. Outsiders, if they came at all, saw only a quiet, self-sufficient community, its wounds hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy. But beneath that surface, the scars of the orphan's plague ran deep-etched into every heart, every whispered lullaby, every shadow that flickered at the edge of memory. The parents who had lost children grew old before their time. Their eyes, once bright with hope, became haunted and distant. They spoke little of the past, and when they did, it was only in fragments, half-remembered dreams, the echo of a name, a lullaby hummed under the breath. The village learned to live with silence, to fill the empty spaces with routine and ritual. But the grief never truly faded. It became a part of the landscape, as much a feature of Ashen Hollow as the fog or the ancient yew. Children born after the plague grew up in a world shaped by absence. They were watched with a vigilance that bordered on fear, never allowed to stray too far from home, never left alone after dark. They heard stories, of course stories of the night the children vanished, of the lullaby that haunted the fog, of the price the land demanded. But the details were always vague, the truth always just out of reach. The elders, those who remembered, refused to speak of what had happened. The silence became a kind of inheritance, passed down from one generation to the next. Yet the legacy of Ashen Hollow was not only silence, but a kind of horror that lingered in the bones. There were nights when the fog grew thick, and the wind carried a melody that no one dared to follow. On those nights, the villagers locked their doors and gathered by the fire, clutching their children close, praying that the past would not return. Some claimed to see shapes moving in the mist, small figures, pale and silent, their eyes wide with longing. Others dreamed of empty graves, of hands reaching up from the earth, of voices calling from beneath the yew. The village endured, as it always had, but the cost was a kind of forgetting, a deliberate erasure of memory, a refusal to name the horror that had claimed their children. The churchyard remained empty, the records incomplete, the story of the orphan's plague reduced to a cautionary tale, a warning whispered to restless children. But the land remembered, and so did the fog. And in the quiet moments, when the world held its breath, The people of Ashen Hollow felt the weight of what had been lost, a grief too deep for words, a silence that would never be broken. If you have ever wondered how a place survives the unspeakable, look to Ashen Hollow. Outwardly, it recovered. Inwardly, it became a monument to absence, a village haunted not by ghosts, but by the memory of laughter that once filled the air, and the horror of a night when the world forgot how to mourn. What does it mean to remember, and what does it mean to forget? In Ashen Hollow, the line between the two became as blurred as the fog that swallowed the village. The orphan's plague was not just a tragedy of vanished children, but a tragedy of memory, a wound so deep that the only way to survive was to bury it, to let silence take root where grief should have grown. But is forgetting truly a mercy, or is it another kind of curse? We are taught that memory is sacred, that to remember is to honor the lost. Yet in Ashen Hollow, memory became a source of pain so sharp it threatened to unravel the very fabric of the community. The villagers chose silence, not out of indifference, but out of necessity. They learned to live with the ache of absence, to build their lives around the empty spaces left behind. But in doing so, they also lost something essential, a part of themselves, a piece of their history that could never be reclaimed. There is a peculiar horror in erasure, in the deliberate unmaking of a story. The children of Ashen Hollow were not only taken from their families, but from the world's memory. No graves, no names, no songs sung in their honor. Only the fog, the silence, and the uneasy sense that something vital had been stolen. In the end, the village survived, but at what cost? Is it better to carry the weight of grief, to let memory wound us again and again, or to let the past dissolve into silence, unspoken and unresolved? Perhaps the true legacy of Ashen Hollow is not the loss itself, but the questions it leaves behind. What do we owe to the past, and to those who are lost to us? How do we honor pain without letting it consume us? And when faced with a darkness that defies understanding, do we cling to the comfort of forgetting, or do we dare to remember, even when it hurts? I invite you to reflect on these questions. What is worse, remembering or forgetting? Would you choose the solace of silence or the agony of memory? Have you ever known a loss so profound that words failed you? That the only way forward was to let go of the story entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us build a community not just of listeners, but of witnesses, people willing to hold space for the stories that others would rather forget. In the end, perhaps the only way to break the silence is to speak, to remember, to bear witness. Ashen Hollow's story is not just a tale of horror and loss, but a reminder that every silence hides a story, and every story deserves to be told.